So, dear guests, dear participants, on behalf of TAİK, I would like to thank you all for joining our first webinar, TAİKTransatlanticTalks. I hope you and your families are safe and healthy. I would also like to thank our communications partner, Mercury, for supporting our first webinar. Today, we are celebrating TAİK's 35th anniversary. Prime Minister Turgut Özal and President Ronald Reagan witnessed the signing ceremony to establish TAİK. They would have been extremely pleased to see we are celebrating our 35th year despite the challenging times that have forced everyone to stay under quarantine in their homes. For more than 3 decades, we have been working to establish stronger ties between Turkish and US business people. I want to emphasize that now, more than ever, we need to continue strengthening our business relations, even while we are dealing with this pandemic. As Turkey's oldest business council, TAİK has been and will continue working across its network to bring business leaders and experts from Turkey and US together. We must strengthen the ties between us as we look for joint solutions to the global challenges we are now facing. I would like to kick off our conversation today by introducing our esteemed speaker. We are fortunate to have with us today Mr. Thomas Friedman, a New York Times columnist and 3-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize. Mr. Friedman, welcome.
Great to be with you, Mehmet.
Joining us as our moderator is former Senator David Vitter of the great state of Louisiana. Senator Vitter served 2 terms in Congress before serving 2 terms in the Senate and is now a partner at Mercury in Washington, D.C. Senator Vitter, welcome.
Thank you.
It is my pleasure now to turn the floor over to you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much, Chairman Yalcindag, and welcome to all of the participants of this webinar. Certainly a pleasure for me to help host this important event. And I want to start by also congratulating TAİK on its 35th anniversary and 35 very productive years of building the relationship, in particular between Turkey and the US and that transatlantic alliance. Congratulations on all of that important work. Of course, TAİK is a very significant organization, has 115 member companies. Between them all, those companies represent over 50% of the Turkish GDP. And of course, that includes very significant leading companies, Sabancı, Cook Holding, Turkish Airlines, Turkcell. It also includes American companies and American partners, Facebook, Citibank, Microsoft, Apple. So it's a very significant and productive organization. Of course, now in the midst of this crisis, we need the sort of transatlantic work and cooperation that TAİK is known for more than ever. And I would point out that that is certainly going on in Turkey on an international level. For instance, NATO General Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg just tweeted about Turkish cargo planes carrying important medical supplies to Italy and Spain. And that same sort of outreach is going on beyond Turkey to non-NATO member states, including China, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Palestine, and Yemen. So I congratulate you and your members participating in all of that work. And of course, there's important work to do within Turkey, and I would highlight the National Solidarity Campaign within Turkey and invite all of TAİK's members to participate in that important campaign through contributions and help. And I think you all know the outlets you can go to participate in that very important campaign. As the chairman mentioned, This series is called Transatlantic Talks. This was designed before the present crisis arose, but certainly there's no more important need for this sort of discussion and communication and cooperation than this present coronavirus crisis. So perhaps it's appropriate that we start at this time. And we could not have a more impressive guest to kick off these talks than we do today in Thomas Friedman. The chairman introduced him, very impressive background. Tom is a widely respected writer and political commentator, 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner, weekly columnist for the New York Times, author of at least 7 books, and he's in particular focused throughout his career on foreign affairs, global trade, the Middle East, globalization, environmental issues, educational issues, etc. So we're all, Tom, very eager to hear your perspective on the present crisis. I thought I would kick it off, Tom, if that's okay. And then ahead of time, we have invited TAIK members to submit questions and topics. And so in our discussion, I'll go through those questions and topics. And I'll try to weave those through about 5 big subtopics, which are global economics, globalization, geopolitics, education, and then finally, US politics. So with that, let me kick off the discussion. Tom, as you know today, and as we've discussed, this audience is composed of Turkish business leaders, very involved, very interested in international trade and commerce. What are some of the top ways the world after the coronavirus will be different than the world before, specifically in terms of international business and commerce? I'm not hearing you. I don't know if that's...
It was muted. It was muted. Okay. David, thank you for the introduction. Mehmet, thank you for the introduction. It's a treat to be here with this group of business leaders from Turkey. People know from my writing, I'm a big Turkey fan and have many friends there, and really wishing you all the best. So let me try to start, David, at 30,000 feet, and then we'll sort of come down. At 30,000 feet, I would begin by saying this. You may recall during the 2008 economic crisis, Warren Buffett famously said, when the tide goes out, you see who's wearing a bathing suit and who isn't. And we then spoke during the 2008 crisis of stress tests. At that time, we were talking about stress tests of our bank. What the coronavirus is a giant global stress test. And it shows you who's wearing a bathing suit and who isn't. What do I mean by that? It shows you the quality of your governance. Well, that's going to become quickly apparent. We've been dealing with that challenge in our own country, surprised by failings of our own state, local, and federal governments to anticipate and manage the crisis. Number one. It shows you the quality of your companies, their balance sheets, who was living on the edge on credit, who was managing their balance sheet well. It's telling you about the solidarity of your society, how well people can come together in social partnerships and in public-private partnerships. And it's stressing families and communities. And so in every way, this is a unique, unprecedented global stress test. And every country, I think, is now doing a kind of internal audit, every company, on how they're doing on that test. Now, in terms of globalization, I wrote The World is Flat in 2004, 2005, basically. And ever since that book came out, I will tell you, every year someone has written, globalization is over, globalization is over. The world isn't flat, it's spiky, lumpy, curvy, jumpy. The libraries are full of books about how globalization is over. I don't buy it. there's no question this crisis is a unique challenge to globalization. It has put it on pause. There's no question about it. But think of what we're doing right now, because it gets to the core of my very thesis about globalization. Who owns the term of globalization? Is it economists or is it people like myself? If it's economists, they will tell you globalization is a measure of one thing. It's a measure of trade. Well, certainly that's part of it. And if it's a measure of trade, then David, globalization now is truly on hold and will be diminished over the next 6 to 9 months, depending on when and how we emerge from this crisis. But if globalization is how I define it, your ability to act globally as an individual and as a company, globalization not only isn't going away, it's going to come out of this stronger. Because if I have technologies that allow me to have customers who are global, suppliers who are global, and employees who are global, and leverage that, then I'm going to be global. And what we're doing right now through the magic of Zoom is acting globally as individuals and companies. So in the next 6 to 9 months, I think you're going to see a lot of that form of globalization. I expect after that, we'll come back with the trade and the more classic interpretations of it. But the way I think of this transition, David, is like this. Right now, we're in a world of abnormal. We're going to go from the world of abnormal to the world of what I would call the new abnormal, and hopefully back to normal over the next 12 to 18 months. Normal is when we get a vaccine, when everyone in the world can be comfortable that they have a vaccine that inoculates and immunizes them from the coronavirus. Where we are right now is no vaccine, and this is clearly crushed business and trade. The next phase of this, what's going to fill in, David, between where we are now and that vaccine is going to be technology. You can already see here in America, I don't know about in Turkey, but in America, an explosion of tracking apps. And so what are these apps? They're after 9/11, we wanted to track you. We had a whole set of civil liberties issues. We wanted to track you because I wanted to know if I was sitting next to you on an airplane, you weren't a terrorist. Now I want to know if I'm sitting next to you on an airplane, did you have coronavirus? Were you near people with coronavirus? Did someone take your temperature before you got on this airplane? What community did you come from? Was it one densely populated with coronavirus or one that actually got ahead of the curve? And what you're seeing right now, David, just the beginnings of, is an explosion of these apps. And they will be on your phone, they will be mobile, they will be tracking, they will be surveilling, they will be highly intrusive. There will be big civil liberties issues over these in America, just as there were after 9/11. But they will fill in, enable, and empower globalization and commerce between where we are now, this situation of abnormal, and when we get back to normal when there's a vaccine. So that's basically how I see the big picture.
Great. Now you mentioned getting back to normal with the vaccine. Even with the vaccine, do you think there's going to be a very new normal, or it's going to look and feel like the old normal?
Well, you know, I've been reading a lot lately about the 1918 epidemic,
Right.
flu.
I'm sure it included the book by my friend John Barry.
Yeah, and it's we went through, the world went through this 100 years ago without cell phones, and we got out of it, and we ended up globalizing and doing all those things. So if there is a vaccine, obviously it's going to be a transition, but if there is a vaccine, I see the reversion to the mean, the reversion to normal happening relatively quickly. It won't happen overnight, of course, but I think, again, technology, these mobile tracking apps will be a real bridge between where we are now and to that world.
Right. Let me pick up on the globalization theme. Obviously, as that trend has accelerated, say, in the last 40 years, that's involved a lot of things, including the relaxation in some ways of the significance of national borders. And then more recently, there's clearly been political reaction against that, or some pushback on that, in light of the threat of terrorism, illegal immigration, et cetera. Will this coronavirus crisis have a significant impact on that debate? And if so, how?
Well, this is a question that's particularly relevant for Turkey as a country, a society, and Turkish companies. So I'm going to start again at 30,000 feet and then come down. So bear with me here just for a little bit. For millennia, our world was actually governed by empires. The Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Mongol Empire, the British Empire. That's actually how we governed the world for millennia. Until the 19th and 20th centuries with decolonization, post-World War I, post-World War II, we actually divided the world up into 190 nation states. And we began the post-World War II world with the United Nations with like 190 separate countries. The world's never been governed that way. The 50 years after World War II were a fantastic time to be a weak little country. Oh my God, if you were a weak country, that was your era. Why? Because first of all, there were two superpowers competing on a global chessboard for your affection, sending you money, foreign aid, wheat, educating your kids at Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, or Louisiana State University in your home state. Rebuilding your army. Syria could lose 3 wars to Israel and get its army rebuilt for free, all 3 times. Building your government house. They were doing all kinds of things to prop up these weak states, number 1. Number 2, climate change was very moderate. Number 3, populations were really under control. Number 4, no one had a cell phone to compare their leadership with the village next door, let alone the capital or the country next door. And lastly, China was not in the World Trade Organization. So every country in the world, including Turkey, could be in the low-wage textile business. Now, my argument, David, is that all of that flipped in the early 21st century. Now, no superpower wants to touch you because all they win is a bill. What Russia's doing in Syria is very unusual, and it's all military, really. Basically, no superpower wants to touch you anymore. Number 2, populations have exploded in these countries. Number 3, climate change is now hammering a lot of these countries. Number 4, everyone has a cell phone to compare themselves, their leader in their village to the village next door, and to see what Paris looks like. And a lot of those cell phones today now have human trafficking apps on them. And lastly, China is in the World Trade Organization, so nobody can be in the textile business. It really affected low-wage industries everywhere. So what all those changes have done before Corona, okay, in what I call the BC world, before Corona, is what all those stresses did is that they began to fracture the weakest little states. In our hemisphere, we saw it in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. In Turkey's world, we saw it in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Libya. And as these states fractured, they began to hemorrhage their people. They created vast zones of disorder, and their people wanted to get out of their worlds of disorder and come to the world of order. And what was one of the first bus stops? Turkey. And so what's happened, the biggest geopolitical thing happening in the world before Corona was a movement of people from fracturing weak states, mostly in the South, to get out of their worlds of disorder into the world of order. We got them from Central America, Turkey got them from sub-Saharan Africa, and from across the Middle East all the way to Afghanistan, Turkey and Europe and its neighbors. And this, of course, changed the politics of the world of order, creating many populist nationalist backlashes. Now, again, I stress all of this was happening BC, before Corona. Now, what the coronavirus is going to do, going back to my opening point about stress tests, is that if you have weak governance before coronavirus, weak public health system, it's only going to expose that even more. And so one of Turkey's biggest geopolitical challenges is it is going to be target number 1 as a zone of order of people trying to get out of their zones of disorder to Turkey's south, coming across the Mediterranean and also overland from Central Asia.
And as that happens and essentially accelerates a pre-existing trend, as you suggest, what does that do in terms of the overall globalization debate? I have to think it puts more pushback on that trend in a lot of people's minds.
Well, the globalization, again, in the short run, it's going to be really stressed because countries with differing corona challenges and differing quality public health systems are going to not want to be overwhelmed by anyone coming in from the outside, either bringing disease or simply bringing stress on their system. So you're already seeing borders going up all over Europe. There's another longer term challenge for Europe, which Turkish business leaders will have to be considering, and it starts with Italy and Spain. But let's use Italy. So Italy is going to be hugely stressed economically. It already is, obviously, because of coronavirus and the massive outbreak there. Germany, much less so, we already see. So coming out of this crisis, the tension between countries within the European Union who will want to massively stimulate with government funding, as we've done in America, and those who will need that massive stimulation, like Italy, versus those like Germany and France, who might want to stimulate less to preserve the value of the euro and their savings. There's going to be huge tension over that issue. And we could actually see Italy break up the European Union over this stimulus issue. It may decide it simply has to go alone. It has to go back to its own currency and basically devalue on a massive scale in order to get the stimulus it needs to recover from this crisis. So I'd very much be watching from the Turkish industry point of view, the relationship between Italy, Germany, France, and the whole question of stimulus as we come out of this crisis.
Great, thank you. Let's go to the questions we've collected from TAIK members, as I mentioned, and we're going to walk through about 5 big categories. The first, probably the most important to most members that we've been already somewhat focused on, is global economics. So one big overarching question from a member: what are the worst case and best case options on a global level in terms of timing, going back to normalization of life, economic impact, number of casualties, and the integrity of the social order? Pretty big picture question, but what do you think are sort of worst case and best case?
So right now, if you follow, let's use the American stock market as a proxy. Right now, the American stock market has priced in a recession. So it's down about 30% from its highs. If we feel, and if we see that not only we, but Europe and our Asian allies are not overcoming this crisis, that the trend line is not steadily going down, the markets will begin to price in depression, a global depression. They're not there yet, though. I hope they don't go there. And the big debate here in America is, has the market found its bottom yet? Is it bouncing along the bottom, or does it have one more leg down to go? And all of that is going to depend on the varied responses that we're seeing on the healthcare front to the virus. For instance, before our conversation, I was just Googling around California hospitals. It's remarkable that California hospitals have not been overwhelmed at all. They're sitting there waiting for people to come in, because California really got out ahead of this. And Lord knows that could change in an hour. I pray it stays that way. But you're going to get really varied response as a result of this. California may be 2 weeks ahead in coming out of this. That really matters. How bad does New York get? New York's it's home of Wall Street. It's our financial center. Does it get to peak sometime in the next 2 weeks and begin to go down? Does it not? My wife is building a museum in Washington, for instance, to promote reading and literacy. It's called Planet Word. So we were building in the middle of all this. We faced a situation where our contractors from New York, in order to work on the project, had to quarantine for 14 days before they could come into the museum. Then when they went back to New York, they were being asked to quarantine 14 more days. So you can see what kind of sand can get in the gears as well. Everything depends basically on the peaking point of this virus, and whether after it peaks, you can, on the basis of data, begin to quickly fold your healthy and young people back into the workforce. And that's why the only advice I would give to my friends in Turkey, which I'd give to any other country, is you cannot shut down harder, faster, longer enough now if you want to come out of this early later.
And just as a guesstimate, what does early look like and what does worst case look like in time in your guesstimate?
You know, I think early looks sometime getting back to what I call that new abnormal, sometime in the summer, a June, July, August period, where you will be able to go out, but you're going to want your own technology to be, I think everyone's going to be wearing a mask here for the next 6 months, as our president has already urged in public. But that will be also part of the new abnormal. But also you're going to want to venture out with these technology apps that give you some level of reassurance that the place you're working in and the people you're interacting with are not going to give you the virus. I think you will see that. There'll be a lot of, and I think we can go a long way to get to take depression off the table if in this June, July, August timeframe more of us can fold back into the workplace.
Right. Okay. As we get at least to the new abnormal, here's another question from a member. What specific steps should national governments be taking to sustain or restart both national and international commerce?
You know, again, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but right now in this phase, what are we trying to do? We're trying to go for total harm minimization. What is total harm minimization? We want to minimize the harm to our people and their public health, and we want to minimize the harm to our economy and our companies and their economic health. And everyone should be looking for the sweet spot that gives you the most total harm minimization. And I would say there the formula is now pretty clear. You need massive government stimulus because none of us have experienced this kind of hard stop to our economies, literally a hard stop for 2 months. And a lot of weak businesses, a lot of strong businesses cannot, especially in retail, cannot sustain that for very long. We've got to use governments to prop up and stimulate demand and to enable companies not to lay off their workers in large numbers, or if they do so, at least to provide them some benefits. That's one clearly key pillar to the formula. The second, and again, you just cannot emphasize this enough, you have to get people to shelter in place. Break the transmission of the virus. Once people are sheltered in place for at least 2 weeks, this disease manifests itself usually between 5 and 12 days if you've got it. So if you're sheltered in place for 14 days, you will either you'll either not manifest it, you will manifest the disease, and like about 75% of the people be able to actually handle it at home. You may manifest the disease and it be totally asymptomatic, which we find is about 10 to 15% of people, in which case only a test will reveal that you have it or had it. About 10 to 15% of people will require hospitalization, and roughly 1% will tragically die. Those numbers pretty well line up across the country. But I cannot stress enough now that if you want total harm minimization to your public health and your companies, the more you shelter in place everybody now, the easier and quicker you will come out of it.
Okay. And then with regard to the economic half of that minimization and sort of restarting the economy, what do you suggest specifically for emerging markets like Turkey? What should they do specifically to gain strength in the global economy as we come out of this?
Well, again, you know, a lot of this is people want to know that you're a trusted partner in health terms. You know, if I'm going to collaborate with you, have your people come here, have your airlines land in my country, import your goods and services, leverage your people, for the first time, again, people are going to want to know your health metrics. If I were a company, I would be moving to these health apps very quickly. First of all, for my own people, to enable them to come to work, but also as a badge that I would want to show my global partners that I'm managing my healthcare as well as my commerce and economy during this period. That healthcare badge, how well you are managing it as a family, a community, a company, and a country in this transition period is going to be very, very important, I think, for a country like Turkey, especially because it depends on tourism. And for Turkey's tourism industry to come back, which will require Turkish Airlines to come back, for all its hotels and restaurants, they should be thinking right now, what can we do post, when people are allowed to come out again, what can we be doing to assure our customers and clients they can interact with us? So if you look at South Korea, every restaurant in South Korea has a mobile temperature. They take your temperature before you can go in. I think these apps will get even more intrusive. And believe me, from my point of view, the more intrusive, the better. Because the more intrusive they are, the more security they will provide, and the quicker we will get back to normal commerce. And so I think every company in Turkey today should be thinking, how do I invest in that for my customers, my clients, my employees, to ensure and enable their health and be able to present and demonstrate that in a credible, authoritative way to my partners around the world.
Great. Okay, another TAIK member question. Some countries are largely self-sufficient in terms of food supply, but many aren't. WHO has already warned about food shortages. How will agricultural policies change? And will digitalization offer opportunities there?
Well, again, if I'm going to import, there's no, there's been no cases of, I imported your beef, your wheat, and it had coronavirus, in it. That's not how it's transported. It's aerosol. It's people coughing and sneezing and spreading it that way. And its half-life, if I cough on this computer and 2 hours from now, God forbid, my wife touches it, it's very questionable her ability to contract the virus from that unless she literally touches the computer and then puts her hand in her mouth, number one. And one of the things we've also learned is that dosage matters. One of the stories that people noted was the Chinese doctor who was actually censored by the government for basically being a whistleblower on the virus early on, and who tragically died. He was a young man. People wondered, why did this young man die? And it's led to a number of stories that actually the dosage of your exposure to this virus matters. So a doctor who was dealing all day with coronavirus victims early on, also when we understood less, was obviously being exposed to huge doses. But good hygiene, I wash my hands. If we take takeout, from the local pizza parlor, the box comes, yes, I'll open the box, I throw it out immediately, and the first thing I do is I wash my hands. So I think good hygiene really, really matters. And the great struggle for emerging markets, and these are countries where Turkish businessmen who have been so entrepreneurial and going out into the world and finding opportunities to build factories, do commerce. Emerging markets will be struggling over this. A place like India, for instance, which sent so many people back home to their villages and said, wash your hands. And the people said, wash my hands in what? With what? If you get sick, go to the doctor. What doctor? And do social distancing. Where? So different emerging markets are going to be impacted differently by this as a result.
Okay, we have a couple of questions about the money system and monetary policy. Are you expecting any big changes in the monetary system after Corona? And if so, how?
Look, I'm not an expert on this, David, but I try to talk to experts on this. And it's just hard to believe with the US government already having done a $2 trillion bailout. We basically spent the equivalent of our entire budget in a week. with every government in the world needing to do that over the next couple of months, that we aren't debasing our currencies, and that metals at some point, and I can't tell you when, I'm not a prognosticator, but diversifying your portfolio where you have some gold or precious metals in a world where every government in the world is going to be printing money has to be a consideration. Again, I don't give stock advice, but it's certainly something I'm thinking about.
Right. And what about another member asked, what about digital money, and what are alternatives for a digital value unit? And is that something that will be accelerated because of this or not?
Hard to know. You know, Bitcoin is held up in this crisis. It's been kind of interesting. I would just say this, that again, one of the things I've learned as a journalist, the biggest mistakes I've made as a journalist is when I began a news story or a column by saying, the world will never be the same. Oh my God. I've made a lot of mistakes saying that. Our ability, our desire, our innate capacity to find our way back to normal, you know, is very, very deep. And so I do believe there'll be an AC and BC world, certainly in the near term. How much will last after that? I don't know. You know, it took a few years, but the 1918 pandemic, again, it was terrible. But we got over it. We moved on. We ended up globalizing the whole world. So there's very much a timing factor here. Near term, medium term, long term. And I think you just have to be very nimble as a company and an investor, but understanding what are the core things that will allow my business to survive this transition. Strong balance sheet, and my ability in a world where everybody is going to be asking every single person they interact with, is this person going to give me the virus or not? Your ability as a company to demonstrate that you are a healthy company and a healthy person individually, and your salespeople are, that will be critical in the near term.
And that sort of dovetails into the next question from another member. What about supply chains? What would you be thinking about in terms of reorganizing supply chains specifically post-coronavirus?
So I think we're going to see two things around supply chain. One is in certain areas, they're going to be shortened. Americans have discovered that we actually make no vaccines in America. In fact, all our experimental drugs, actually the raw materials are made in China. They're shipped from China to Germany for assembly, to Britain for testing, and then back to America. Americans, I didn't know that until this crisis started. So I think there's going to be a certain set of critical tools that there's no question people are going to want to shorten their supply chains. At the same time, I think there's going to be an explosion of 3D manufacturing that gives me a certain set of parts. I've been talking to US military people about this, that we're going to want to know that through 3D printing, we can make locally. And so providing those kind of capabilities as Turkish companies for other governments and societies, or for Turkey itself, thinking about what were the things in this crisis that Turkey found it was short of, and having that 3D printing capability, I think is going to be very important going forward.
Great. And here's a question about something you've spent a lot of time on, energy and the environment. While the crisis triggered more awareness about global dependence on fossil fuels, it has also produced extremely low oil prices. So that obviously makes further investment in alternatives less feasible. So where will all of that go from here?
It's a very important question. So again, I'm going to start it from 30,000 feet. There are huge similarities between a global pandemic and climate change, and how you mitigate and deal with them. There's only one difference between climate change and a global pandemic, and that is that climate change will be so much worse, because climate change doesn't peak. The global pandemic peaks and then it comes back. climate change doesn't peak. If the Greenland and Antarctic ice shelves melt, they will no longer reflect the sun. Those sun's rays will be absorbed by the oceans will rise and they will be warmer, and we know what that will produce. It will produce much more extreme weather patterns. So if you didn't believe in viruses and you didn't believe in climate change, I would urge you to review and rethink those positions. And the same way we confront viruses, we have to confront climate change, which is the scientists, when it comes to climate change, tell us we need to manage what is unavoidable so we can avoid what is unmanageable. We are in that phase right now with the virus of trying to manage what is now unavoidable so we can avoid what would be just unmanageable, the overwhelming of our healthcare systems. We need to take this virus as our warning heart attack on climate change. But for reasons you've just described, David, the collapse in global energy prices, it's not only challenging wind and solar, but it's going to wipe out the fracking natural gas industry in America. It already is bankrupting company after company in that space. And so for me, the real question is, can we learn that lesson? Because part of your resilience will be being able to produce massive amounts of wind, solar, and any other renewables you can, so you aren't dependent on global supply chains, so we aren't exacerbating climate change, because climate change doesn't peak, and there's no herd immunity to climate change. All there is an endless hammering on the herd. We do not want to go there.
Okay, let me transition to globalization, which we've certainly touched on in a very significant way already. One of our member questions is this: do you expect this coronavirus experience to lead to an increase in nationalism? And what will be the impact of that on global trade?
So in the short run, yes, we've already seen that. And unfortunately, America has contributed to that. You know, historically, America in a global crisis played three roles. One, we were the leader. We convened everybody. Two, we were the source of the best science and information. And three, we were the source of help, of aid and assistance. And unfortunately, and I'm not going to get into politics here, but we have played none of those roles in this crisis. I do hope afterwards, there's going to be obviously short-run move to nationalism, but in the end, what do we learn most? What we learn most from this crisis is we're only as strong as we work together, that we don't compete with each other over global ventilators, that we compete in the best way possible to be the first to come up with a vaccine who can then share it with the world. So this crisis, David, in the short run is producing much more nationalism and fractures to globalization. But if we're thinking and if America provides, I think, the right leadership, we will understand that to prevent the next pandemic and to get over this crisis, we need to be much more coordinated and globalized. Because in the end, a world where people are freely trading with one another is a more prosperous world, especially for a country like Turkey, which has this incredibly dynamic business community that has depended on being exporters and importers across the world.
Right. Picking up on that need for international cooperation, several members actually asked the following question in slightly different ways. Why did the G7 and G20 countries apparently fail to have a joint strategic plan for a pandemic like this when that was clearly a threat? First of all, do you agree with that premise that they had no clear strategic plan, and if so, why?
Yeah, again, you know, there's so many things that governments have to plan for, and this is a once in a century event. And I personally don't spend a lot of time saying, how could you have missed this once in a century event and not had a million ventilators, you know, in stockpile? It's not human nature to be able to see and imagine this. You know, David, after 9/11, you may recall, we had many studies. So how did 9/11 happen in America? And one of the conclusions was, I was actually the originator of this phrase, we had a failure of imagination. We never imagined that people would do such a thing as fly airplanes into our Twin Towers. Well, we've had another failure of imagination here. And yes, there are people who predicted it and wrote about it, but societies are very, very, very lax and find great difficulty in imagining the worst case scenario, a global pandemic, and having everything prepared for that. So for me, the real question and how leaders around the world will be judged is not, did you have warehouses full of ventilators and masks and testing kits for coronavirus when it hit? It's how quickly did you respond? How quickly did you respond in the right ways? And right now, a lot of leaders around the world are having their report cards filled in that way.
Let's transition to geopolitics, which we've already touched on in some ways. One member asks, will this crisis end up constituting a creative destruction, as in the nature of capitalism, and the beginning of a significantly new world order?
Very interesting question. I'd answer it this way. I believe the most powerful force on the planet is Mother Nature. I believe the second most powerful force on the planet is Father Greed, the market. What we're seeing here is these two giant forces at play. Now, most of us have been through market crises. We've seen how brutal and merciless the market can be when it comes to weak companies with weak balance sheets and high leverage. But the market is nothing when it comes to brutality compared to Mother Nature. So Mother Nature is just chemistry, biology, and physics. That's all she is. You can't talk her up, you can't talk her down. You can't say, Mother Nature, we're having a bad crisis in our market right now. Could you lay off a little bit? Now she's going to do whatever chemistry, biology, and physics dictate. And Mother Nature, as one of my teachers likes to say, always bats last. And she always bats 1,000. So one of the failures, I would argue, of our administration is that our president tended to look at the market as his indicator of whether we were fighting the virus, Mother Nature, well. So if the market held up or went up because of some government action, he thought we were winning against Mother Nature. But while all of that was happening, Mother Nature was silently, invisibly, relentlessly, and mercilessly spreading the virus around the country. And Mother Nature, unlike the stock market, she doesn't start her day at 9:30, she doesn't end at 4, and she doesn't take weekends off. And so we are getting used to, we are learning what it's like to be up against Mother Nature. And when she's hammering you, she also has wonderful upsides as well. We're going to use physics, chemistry, and biology to create a vaccine here. That's also from Mother Nature. But right now we're feeling her wrath. And that is something no country and no company, David, should underestimate. And Mother Nature, just to finish this, uses viruses. She has many Darwinian engines she uses to demonstrate and reveal the survival of the fittest, who is fit physically, and in this case, who is fit economically. And viruses are one of her engines for sorting out the survival of the fittest.
And to look at the question again, do you think that process will lead to a significantly different international order, or would you revert to your comment from a few minutes ago that we should be careful about, immediately saying everything's going to be different now?
I do believe that companies with strong balance sheets and cash are going to find, and this is why Mother Nature has forest fires. They're going to find some incredible companies to buy when the smoke clears here. There's just no question about it. There's going to be an incredible fire sale of companies that basically are good companies, had good businesses, but simply could not raise capital in order to get through this crisis. And so, you know, just think of that. I mean, sort of, you know, what kind of income did you have coming in here? What kind of capital did you have coming in here? You know, what kind of sort of overall corporate structure did you have? If that is solid, if you can pass that stress test and get through this crisis, there'll be a huge amount of consolidation and workouts that are going to have to happen, and there will be opportunities. I don't think the world's just going to snap back like that, but I do believe we will, you know, gradually come back, and strong companies who can make it through this crisis will have many opportunities.
Here's a question that'll certainly impact geopolitics. Do you think that China overall has managed the pandemic well? And is the Chinese government transparent enough to regain the trust of the international community?
Really, really good question, and just too hard to tell. What if the pandemic comes back there in 3 months? What if we discover the data aren't accurate? We have to ask all of those questions. What I tend to look at in China are not their coronavirus statistics, but things like electricity usage, you know, factory capacity usage. Those tend to be more revealing and probably more accurate figures about what's actually happening in the economy, and those have trended upward. But I would say it's too soon for anyone to boast, we survived this, we did better than anybody else, look at us. Every country will have its challenges. China, one of its early challenges were doctors were afraid to tell the truth. They didn't want to deliver bad news in a more authoritarian system. That was their weakness. Our weaknesses in America is we have a very federal system, very slow to react top down, can't kind of order top down everything in one place. So we have governors who got on top of it, governors who less got on top of it. Every system had its strengths and weaknesses. And when it's all over, David, there will be an overall stress test. You know, I wrote about, and who did the best under it. I wrote early on a column about some research by a friend of mine at the University of Maryland, who divides cultures in the world up between tight and loose cultures. So tight cultures are very rule-bound, orderly, they you know, take direction very well. I think of Korea, Singapore, China. Loose cultures, everyone's very individualistic, don't take orders well, not very orderly. Think of Italy, think of many parts of America. So it turns out in a pandemic, tight cultures are doing, Germany, Singapore, China, South Korea, tend to be able to respond to these better than loose cultures. I'm not sure where Turkey is on the tight and loose spectrum. Someone will have to tell me.
Okay. One topic that you brought up as we were planning for this discussion is education. What are your thoughts about how this will impact education beyond the crisis? Obviously, it's completely disrupted it and put it online for now, but what about as we begin to come out of the crisis stage?
I think you'll see it go in two directions at once and intensify in both directions. One is online education is going to explode. As David, as you know, one of the biggest issues we have in America is student debt. Students going into debt for $20, $30, $50, $250,000 to get a 4-year degree. People are going to discover in this crisis just how well educated you can get through online systems for a fraction of that cost, and you don't have to go into debt. At the same time, because my wife is a school teacher and my daughter is a school teacher, they will also discover how much they miss the classroom, how much they value a great teacher, how important it is to be in a social setting when you learn. So I think you're going to see both extremes get intensified. More online learning, but also more appreciation for great teachers and great schools.
Okay. And then finally, to wrap up the discussion, although most of the interest and focus was international commerce for obvious reasons, given TAIK's mission and membership, there were some obvious questions from members about US politics. So what does your crystal ball say about the impact of all of this on the presidential election, President Trump's re-election effort, and on the US election more broadly, meaning Congress, I guess?
So I think it's too soon to tell. And I would really hazard, I would not hazard a guess on how the president will come out of this, because it just so much depends on his performance and where we are. I will share with you, by way of answering your question though, David, what my next column is going to say. And it's directed at Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic candidate against President Trump. And my column will, you may recall in the last debate, Joe Biden said that he promised he was going to appoint a woman as his vice president. And my column is going to call on Vice President Biden not to appoint a woman necessarily, but to appoint a Republican as vice president. A Republican woman, all the better. Why do I say that? Because I think to get through a crisis this strenuous, this stressful, every country should move to a national unity government. Because when we come out of this crisis, there are going to be two giant stressful issues that the next American government, all governments in the world are going to have to deal with. One is equity. Who got bailed out and who didn't? I mean, his company got bailed out. I was a good citizen. I managed my balance sheet well. I husbanded my cash. I protected my cash. I came out of this okay. And this guy got bailed out, and now he can compete against me with government, cheap government money or free government money. There's going to be huge equity issues. Wait a minute, you mean the airlines got bailed out and my little local restaurant, my kebab shop didn't, where I employ 10 people? The equity issues coming out of this are going to be enormous. And secondly, as I alluded to before, the privacy and civil liberties issues coming out of this. I want to know if I'm sitting next to you on a bus, in a taxi, on an airplane, if I'm doing business with you in my shop or my restaurant, that you don't have the coronavirus. The civil liberties issues and the equity issues coming out of this crisis are going to be so great that I hope that President Biden, I would hope President Trump would do it too, but he's not going to, would actually opt for a national unity government, because I think we're going to need that more than ever.
Okay, well, Tom, thank you very much for a really interesting and enlightening conversation. Let me say in wrapping up that Tom is donating any fees associated with this appearance to the Washington area food banks. I want to acknowledge that. And again, in closing, I want to congratulate TAIK on its 35th anniversary today and 35 years of very important work, forging, building, improving the U.S.-Turkish relationship, particularly on an economic level. And I would again urge members to remember the National Solidarity Campaign in Turkey and to contribute to that. I believe you know where you can go to do that and how you can do that. Thank you, Chairman Yalcindag. Thank you for your leadership, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. We deeply appreciate it. And again, Tom, we really appreciate your time, really appreciate your insights.
Thank you for having me. Mehmet, thank you for having me. Good luck to all of you, and please stay safe.
Absolutely. Thank you.